spooky place.
Welcome back to the spooky place, where the stories don't just scare you, they infest you. They slither beneath your skin, coil around your thoughts, and rot in the deepest corners of your mind. Tonight, we gather around the fire, not for warmth, but as a feeble attempt to keep the darkness at bay. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's an invitation. A tale so chilling, so wrong, that once it enters your ears, it burrows deep, and it never leaves. Sleep? Forget it, because in the silence, something will breathe beside you. In the shadows, something will stare back. But be warned, this story doesn't end when the video does. It spreads, it infects, it twists its way into your reality, turning whispers into voices, shadows into shapes. And if you listen too closely, it might just crawl into your soul and make itself at home. So sit back if you dare. But remember, some things once heard don't just haunt you, they own you. The Phantom Hitchhiker. The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the windshield of Thomas's old sedan. The wipers struggled to keep up, their rhythmic squeaking the only sound accompanying him on this desolate stretch of road. It was past midnight, and the woods on either side of the highway loomed like dark sentinels, their shadows stretching long and menacing under the pale glow of his headlights. Thomas had been driving for hours, his eyes heavy with fatigue, but he dared not stop. Not here, not on this road. It was then that he saw her. A figure stood by the side of the road, barely visible through the downpour. She was young, no older than 20, her soaked hair clinging to her face, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if to ward off the cold. Thomas slowed the car, his instincts warring with his better judgment. Hitchhikers were always a risk, especially on a night like this. But something about her, her vulnerability, her stillness, made him pull over. He rolled down the window, the rain spattering inside. "You need a ride?" he called out. She nodded silently, her eyes downcast, and slid into the passenger seat without a word. Thomas noticed how she shivered, her clothes dripping water onto the upholstery. He turned up the heat, but she didn't seem to notice. She just stared straight ahead, her lips trembling, her hands clenched in her lap. "Where are you headed?" Thomas asked, trying to break the eerie silence. "Maple Lane," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Number 17. Thomas frowned. Maple Lane was a good 20 minutes out of his way, but he couldn't bring himself to leave her out here. He nodded and drove on, the silence between them thickening like fog. He glanced at her occasionally, but she never looked back. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes, there was something wrong with her eyes. They were too dark, too empty, as if they'd seen things no living person should. The minutes dragged on, the road stretching endlessly before them. Thomas's unease grew with every mile. The girl didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. He tried to make conversation, but his words fell flat, swallowed by the oppressive silence. Finally, they reached Maple Lane, a narrow, tree-lined street with old, crumbling houses. Number 17 was at the end, a dilapidated Victorian home with peeling paint and broken shutters. The windows were dark, the porch sagging under the weight of neglect. Thomas pulled into the driveway and turned to the girl. "We're here," he said, forcing a smile. She didn't respond. She just sat there, staring straight ahead, her hands still clenched in her lap. Thomas hesitated, then reached out to touch her shoulder. His hand passed through her like mist. He jerked back, his heart pounding. The seat was empty. The girl was gone. Thomas stared at the empty space, his mind racing. He must have imagined her. He must have been more tired than he thought. But the wet seat, the lingering chill in the air, they were real. He stepped out of the car, the rain soaking him instantly, and approached the house. His knocks echoed through the empty street, loud and insistent. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. An old woman stood there, her face lined with age and sorrow. She peered at Thomas with tired eyes, her expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice frail. Thomas swallowed hard. I think I just drove your daughter home. A young woman. She said she lived here." The old woman's eyes widened, and she took a step back. "My daughter," she whispered. "That's impossible. My daughter died 10 years ago. She was hit by a car on this very road." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "But I saw her. She was in my car. She told me to bring her here." The old woman's gaze softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made Thomas's stomach churn. "You're not the first," she said quietly. "Others have seen her too. She's trapped here, you see. She can't move on, not until she finds peace." Thomas shook his head, his mind reeling. This can't be real. This has to be some kind of joke. The old woman reached out and touched his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "You brought her home," she said, "but now she's chosen you. She'll follow you. She'll haunt you, until you help her." Thomas pulled away, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "I don't believe in ghosts," he said, though his voice trembled. The old woman smiled faintly. "You will." Thomas turned and ran back to his car, his heart pounding in his chest. He drove away as fast as he could, the rain and darkness swallowing the road behind him. But no matter how far he went, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The rearview mirror showed only shadows, but he could feel her presence, cold and unyielding, sitting in the back seat. Days turned into weeks, and Thomas tried to convince himself it had all been a dream. But the nightmares wouldn't stop. He saw her everywhere, in the corner of his eye, in the reflection of a window, in the darkness of his bedroom at night. She never spoke, never moved, but her eyes, those empty, haunting eyes, they followed him. One night, he couldn't take it anymore. He drove back to Maple Lane, the road as dark and foreboding as he remembered. The house was still there, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the void. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. The old woman was gone. As he turned to leave, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he turned around. She was there, the girl. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it made his chest ache. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his cheek, and for the first time, she spoke. "Help me," she whispered. "Please." Thomas woke up in his car, the sun rising over the horizon. He was back on the highway, the woods stretching endlessly on either side. The girl was gone, but her voice lingered in his mind, a haunting echo he couldn't escape. He knew then that he would never be free, not until he uncovered the truth about her death, not until he helped her find peace. But some truths are better left buried, and some spirits, they don't want peace. They want revenge, and Thomas had just become their instrument. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound seemed to carry her whisper. The girl's plea, "Help me," echoed in his mind, a relentless mantra that gnawed at his sanity. He tried to convince himself it was all in his head, but deep down, he knew better. She was real, and she wasn't going to let him go. Determined to rid himself of the haunting, Thomas began to dig into the girl's past. He returned to Maple Lane, this time during the day, and knocked on the doors of neighboring houses. Most were reluctant to talk, their faces paling at the mention of the old Victorian home. But one elderly man, who had lived on the street for decades, finally agreed to speak. Her name was Eliza, the man said, his voice trembling. She was a sweet girl, but her life was troubled. Her mother, Margaret, was a recluse. They say she dabbled in things she shouldn't have. Dark things. When Eliza died, it wasn't just an accident. There were rumors, whispers of a ritual gone wrong. Thomas's blood ran cold. A ritual? What kind of ritual? The man shook his head. I don't know the details. But after Eliza died, strange things started happening on this street. People would see her wandering at night, just like you did. Others would hear her crying. Some even claimed she spoke to them, but no one ever helped her. They were too afraid. Thomas thanked the man and left, his mind racing. A ritual? What could that mean? He needed to find Margaret, the old woman who had answered the door that night. But when he returned to the Victorian house, it was empty. The windows were boarded up, the porch littered with debris. It looked as though no one had lived there for years. That night, Thomas dreamed of Eliza. She was standing in the middle of the road, her dress soaked, her eyes pleading. Behind her, the woods stretched endlessly, the trees twisted and gnarled like the fingers of some ancient beast. She reached out to him, her lips moving, but no sound came out. Then, suddenly, the ground beneath her cracked open, and she was pulled into the darkness, her scream echoing in his ears. Thomas woke up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. On his nightstand, he found something that hadn't been there before, a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were yellowed with age, the handwriting inside delicate and faded. It was Eliza's journal. He flipped through the pages, his hands trembling. The entries spoke of a lonely girl, trapped in a house with a mother who was growing increasingly unstable. Margaret had become obsessed with the occult, convinced she could communicate with the dead. She had forced Eliza to participate in her rituals, using her as a conduit to bridge the gap between worlds. The final entry was the most chilling. Mother says tonight is the night. She says I'll finally meet Father, that he's been waiting for us on the other side. But I'm scared. The things she's been saying, the things she's been doing. I don't think this is about Father anymore. I think she's trying to bring something else through. Something dark. I don't want to do this, but she won't listen. She says it's too late to stop now. God help me. The entry ended abruptly, the final words smudged as if tears had fallen on the page. Thomas knew he had to find out what happened that night. He returned to the Victorian house, this time armed with a flashlight and a growing sense of dread. The door creaked open on its own, as if inviting him in. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay, the walls lined with strange symbols carved into the wood. In the basement, he found the remnants of the ritual, a circle of candles, long since burned out, strange markings on the floor, drawn in what looked like dried blood, and in the center of the circle, a single photograph of Eliza, her face crossed out with a jagged X. As Thomas stared at the photograph, the temperature in the room dropped. His breath came out in visible puffs, and the flashlight flickered. He turned around, and there she was, Eliza. But she wasn't the same girl he had picked up on the road. Her face was twisted in rage, her eyes black as coal. Her mouth opened, and a guttural, inhuman voice emerged. "You shouldn't have come here." Thomas stumbled back, his heart racing. "Eliza, I'm trying to help you. Help me," she hissed, her voice echoing as if multiple people were speaking at once. "You can't help me. No one can. She won't let me go." "Who won't let you go?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. Eliza's form flickered, and for a moment, she was replaced by another figure, an older woman with wild eyes and a cruel smile. Margaret. Then Eliza was back, her face contorted in pain. "She's still here," Eliza whispered. "She's trapped me here. She used it to bring something through, but it wasn't Father. It was something else, and now it's feeding on me, on all of us." Thomas realized the horrifying truth. Margaret hadn't just tried to communicate with the dead. She had tried to summon something far more sinister. And when the ritual went wrong, Eliza had become a vessel for the entity, her soul trapped between worlds. But Margaret hadn't escaped unscathed. Her soul was bound to the house as well, forever tethered to the darkness she had unleashed. Eliza reached out to Thomas, her hand cold as ice. "You have to end this," she said. "Destroy the house. Burn it to the ground. It's the only way to free us." Thomas nodded, though his legs felt like they might give out at any moment. He grabbed a can of gasoline from the garage and doused the house, his hands shaking. As he lit the match, he heard Margaret's voice, screaming in rage. The flames spread quickly, consuming the house in a fiery inferno. But as Thomas stood there, watching the house burn, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He turned, and there was Eliza, her face calm now, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Then she was gone. Thomas thought it was over. He thought he had freed Eliza and put an end to the nightmare. But as he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her sitting in the back seat, her eyes empty once more. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" she said, her voice cold and mocking. Thomas's blood ran cold. The house was gone, but the curse was still alive. And now, it was his burden to bear. The road stretched endlessly before him, the darkness closing in. And in the back seat, Eliza smiled. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.